Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore. Your attendance and book purchases are what let us keep having these events, and we love them, so thank you. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from Marc Masters about his new book, High Bias, with Rosali Middleman. Marc Masters is a music journalist whose work has appeared on NPR and in the Washington Post, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, and Bandcamp Daily. He is also the author of No Wave. Rosali makes songs that take their time in revealing their full power. What might first appear to be restrained, introspective compositions will stretch slowly outward, snagging your attention with a subtly sideways guitar lead or an exceptionally raw lyric you didn't catch the first time around. Thank you again, and remember, you can grab a copy of High Bias up at the registers if you haven't already gotten one. Okay, turn it over to y'all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I guess we can start every.
Yeah, we start talking.
I guess I could give you a little intro to the book if you're not familiar with it. It's literally what it says, a history of the cassette tape. It's partially a technical history. I do cover sort of how the technology developed. But it's more culturally a history about music that took advantage of cassettes, genres that came about because of cassettes, or at least utilized them on their way to becoming genres. The international impact of cassettes, cassette bootlegging, mixtape trading, and how cassettes are kind of back now, although we're probably going on 15 years of articles about how cassettes are back. In fact, I found an article about how cassettes were back that predates an article about how cassettes were dying. So basically, I don't think they ever really died, but they are more significantly used now, independent labels, because vinyl's so expensive and takes so long to make. So kind of a summary of what's in the book. There's more too, but that's kind of the big stuff.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading the book. It's like a lot of it, it's kind of aware of all the different aspects of it, but reading it all together, kind of realized just how revolutionary the cassette tape was or is, and from everywhere to making it easy for musicians to put out music that don't have resources, to have a label, and for communities to have grown through taper scenes and like you said, like how the influence of smaller subgenres and subcultures like hip hop throughout the city. So it kind of blew my mind when you put it all together, trying to figure out what else in history, like media, has really had such an impact.
Yeah.
In just like one little object.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's fun because I grew up because I'm sort of the prime age to have when they started to be a thing that everybody was using up till when they fell off a little bit, and now that they're more popular in certain circles. And even then, I didn't, until I started really researching the book, didn't really have a full idea of the scope of how much influence they had and how kind of different they were. I think I probably started getting into music when they pretty much already existed, even though they started not that long before. And so I don't really know if I ever really technically, literally realized how before cassettes came along, people didn't really listen to music outside of their house except live music, because you couldn't carry record players outside. People had reel-to-reel decks, but those were expensive, hard to operate, more for pros. So it made music portable, and also, as a result of making music portable, it made it kind of an individual thing. I don't know that as many people identified themselves with the music they owned before they could carry it around or tape it and give it to other people or make mixes for other people. I think it had a lot to do with something we don't even think about that much anymore, that what music you listen to is part of your personality at this point, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, personalized it all. Just the idea that a blank tape was even made and sold and not just like an object on this format, so that you could personalize your taste and share them with friends.
Right.
And even the materiality of it, like artists using tapes and their actual sounds, the hiss, the looping aspects of it, to use the actual physical object as an art form and not just other music it's pretty wild.
Yeah, there's this kind of funny irony that I guess I'd always kind of thought about but never really articulated, that tapes, especially for artists who were recording straight to cassettes, dubbing cassettes, sending things out on cassettes and distributing cassettes. That became the hiss and the distortion and all the anomalies of tape became almost associated more with authenticity than crystal clear recording, which technically in terms of fidelity is more authentic. It sounds more like what's happening in the studio room. But the authenticity of the tape is that nobody's in between the artist and you. There's no producer telling the artist what to do. There's no money raising really having to happen. It's so cheap to do. So I at least personally, when I hear a hissy tape, I feel like I'm listening to something more real than something that's super clear.
Yeah. It has that kind of, it's almost like a warping of time in this way that exists on there, that when you hear something so crystal clear, you might hear like the age, the date in which it's made, like the production style, but there's something about the quality of a hissing tape that it could really exist in any time.
When did you first encounter tapes?
Well, my parents were deadheads, so they had bootleg tapes, and they're musicians, and so there were cassettes around. But personally, when I was 11, one of my older sisters, she was 18. She gave me a Walkman for Christmas,
Nice.
and I think there were 2 tapes in it. There was Nirvana MTV Unplugged. And then there was like a comp, No Alternative, which was I think like an AIDS awareness comp. And I
Was
felt
Superchunk on that too?
I can't remember.
I think we're on that. I could be wrong.
I've come full circle. But yeah, and then I remember just like feeling so cool walking around with my headphones in, and I'm one of 7 kids, and so I could just isolate myself. Listen to tapes, and then I would started trading with friends, but also a big thing trying to record off the radio, like songs I liked, because I grew up in like the country, far from any kind of record store, and just like trying to catch my favorite songs. So like a lot of them would have like a sound, and like the song would start, but I just like wait. And then it was a big way that a lot of friends, we'd make mixtapes for each other, and dubbing other.
The taping off the radio was a big thing. I mean, because even though radio station programming tended to be pretty repetitive, you still had to wait like at least an hour or 2 to get that song back on again, as opposed to just taping it and being able to listen to it over and over again on a cassette. I have mixes that I made just of things that I taped off the radio that I don't listen to a lot of radio anymore, but when I was growing up, commercial radio, the DJ talked all the way up until the singing started. So I have some songs that I associate with this DJ talk. Still, I can remember what he said because I heard them so many times that way. But yeah, that was, I think at the time I was excited about it, but I don't think I really realized how big a thing that was to have some control over, to not be subjected to exactly how the radio played songs, or not be subjected to only being able to listen to what I could afford to buy.
Right.
That was a pretty big deal that I remember it being a big deal, but now doing this research made me realize how much of a, because really up until then, listeners and artists didn't really have a ton of control over how they did things with their music. So.
Yeah.
Have you been in bands that were recorded on cassettes?
Yeah, band Long Hots, Philly band, which is where I used to live. Our only release has been on cassette that we recorded.
And was it actually recorded?
No, it wasn't recorded to cassette. I should clarify, but we only released it on cassette. We recorded it on a phone, and then put it on cassette. Then we dubbed ourselves, and some of them using a tape duplicator. It's a really like unreliable kind of way to do it, but so some of the tapes we definitely sent out had nothing on them.
Oh, really?
Or like it'd be like 5 minutes of music, but it's okay. It felt punk. But I recently put out a guitar record a solo guitar record under my moniker Edsel Axel, and that was recorded straight to tape by my friend Trevor Reese right over there.
Cool,
He it was just recorded to 4-track, but we didn't use 4-track, it was just one microphone.
And you got a Unifactor tape, that was on.
Yeah, and that was also recorded to phone as well. And that was like done during the first year of the pandemic. They were like just meditations. I was kind of playing guitar every day and was kind of just keeping a record of it, like a journal. But my friend Jason, who runs Unifactor, great tape label out of Cleveland, he asked if I would be interested in releasing some guitar music. So yeah, I had that collection. So that I kind of collaged together in a way.
That's a great one.
Thank you.
Is there specific things you like about having your music released on tape beyond the fact that it's just the practical aspect of the fact that it's faster and cheaper? Or are there things you like about it as sort of an object too?
Yeah, I mean, the aesthetic of it, especially, I grew up in the 90s, has like a nostalgic feel to it. I like that it is, I mean, obviously, like, the cheaper, quicker aspects of it, but there's something a little less precious about it too. And just the format, the way they look, the way they feel.
Right. And if someone buys it and doesn't like it, they can tape over it.
They can tape over it. Yeah, it's really no big deal versus it feeling like, this like dense piece of vinyl that's been, it's very delicate too, it's a tape. My first car only had a tape player. Just like I had tapes just thrown around all over, and they still played on like when CDs came out, and you get a scratch and it was done for. Whereas like fishing out the tape, like I know something while you're driving. And I think I still have some of those tapes laying around.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's there's this a podcast about cassettes that only talks about music on cassettes called Tabs Out, and I interviewed Mike from that for this, and he gave me a quote that I was almost like, I don't even know if I need to write the book down, because the whole quote is, if a record sucks, it sucks. If a tape sucks, you can put something better on it. Which, I mean, doesn't really get more simple than that.
Exactly.
Was there, I hope this doesn't sound self-aggrandizing, was there stuff in the book that you were surprised that you didn't know about that you liked or were surprised by?
Well, I think the depths of things I wasn't super aware of, like a lot of just the scope of it. I mean, I think also something I wrote down just in the beginning, we were talking about the actual invention and of how, tapes got to, came from reel, they got smaller and smaller, and finally Philips came up with the technology for the cassette as we know it. Right. That they gave it away for free, this technology, so there wasn't kind of this competitive nature of the format. Right. In some ways, I feel like that's the initial spirit, like how that kind of traveled out to the way that, tape traders, people taping live shows, it's not for profit, it's not for any kind of commercialization. Not that Philips didn't make money on it, but like that it's shared and it's compatible, and therefore like, the only things that are tweaked are kind of like the higher quality of the tapes.
Yeah, that's kind of an irony. It's an interesting thing that you pointed out, which I don't know if I even made that connection, but it makes sense because when Lou Ottens and Philips developed a compact cassette, one of the big decisions they made, which there's varying stories about this. Their story is we decided to make it so everybody could have it without having to pay for a license. Sony says that Sony went to them and said, if you don't give it to us free, we're going to use another format. And they're like, well, we got to have Sony using our format. Either way that it happened, they decided that they had a better chance of spreading the format around and ultimately making the most profit off of it if they allowed other companies to use so it would be standardized, because there were a lot of other attempts at a similar kind of format, but none that quite had all the qualities that this one did. But so that's kind of like an open community spirit that's behind it, even though it wasn't really, I don't think Lou Ottens ever thought through the ways that would happen in other uses of the tape. But it's almost like osmosis-wise, the fact that it was a sort of an open format to begin with carried on into the way people used it, I guess.
Yeah. Like an idealistic correlation. I'm trying to make it perfect.
But it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense. And I mean, the other irony is that he didn't necessarily think it was going to be for music, because he didn't think it was high quality enough. Probably he thought it'd be voice recording, like reporters would use it. But the great thing is that, like, creative artists, sound quality isn't a big barrier as much as money is. So if you can do something cheaply, who cares what it sounds like necessarily? I mean, it matters, but it matters more that you can do it. And money was making it impossible for a lot of people to record in studio time or being accepted by a label, things like that. So it's pretty easy to look past the sound quality when it's giving you this freedom to do whatever you want with the music.
Right. And now people chase that sound quality, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What
So-
else can we talk about?
Yeah, what made you want to write this book? Like, were you, obviously tapes have been important to you. Is there like a certain, what angle of tapes were you really into? Like, were you like a live taper, or trading tapes?
Yeah, I had some live bootleg kind of things when I was in college and stuff. I liked that aspect of it, but I was never the super like fastidious collector of those where I catalog them and organize them. So that wasn't as much the motivation. I like that aspect. I mean, one kind of neat side product of this whole process is I got to write about the Grateful Dead without writing about their music, which is a big relief. And nothing against the Dead. I know a lot of people who like them and who always taste their respect. I'm a little scarred from growing up in the 80s when their presence was really hard to get away from on college campuses and stuff. So. But I guess the main, I always had an idea that it would be a good subject for a book. And it just seemed like right now the time is perfect because this kind of resurgence has been happening long enough that it has some kind of sustainability. And it's kind of interesting to think of how did it get here? How did it change things then, and how does that inform what is happening with it now? So those are all kind of things that kind of motivated me toward it. I also just got very lucky that Bobby Power, who runs a great tape label in Atlanta called Geographic North, is friends with an editor, Lucas, at UNC Press, and Lucas was looking for someone to write a book about tapes, and Bobby recommended me, so that was really lucky advice. So those were the main motivators, I think. Luckily it was one of these processes where I felt like I knew enough about it that I could get started, but I had a lot to learn in a good way. Like, I feel like that left me open to some of these things that I didn't know about, even things that I thought I knew about, like the go-go scene in DC, which is the area where I grew up. I knew about go-go. I listened to go-go records. I still had no idea, because I wasn't living in DC proper, that tapes motivated so much and circulated so much go-go music, and that there were actually stores you could go to, these PA tapes is what they call them. So the PA Palace was one of them, where you could go in and they'd hand you a catalog of live go-go shows. You could say, I want this one on one side, I want that one on the other side. And the bands were all fine with it. It was the only way their music was getting around.
Yeah.
I wish I'd known about that. When it was really happening, I probably was too young to drive into DC anyway. But I would love to have some of those tapes. You can still find some of them.
So, a tour I was on last fall, we listened to a podcast series about DJ Screw.
Oh yeah.
Who you bring up in the book, because that was heavy in the Houston tape scene, and just how people, I think he had a shoebox that people would put in a request for what, because he would slow down these records, and people want to hear this, and then he would put, they'd put their money in it, and he'd put the tape back out, and then eventually growing to being this huge sound of Houston that even a young Beyonce was on one of the tapes, and you'd get local, rappers and other people. There was a huge scene surrounding him, and
his whole thing, his whole innovation too was slower versions, of, mixing records slowly, which fits really well with the tape. It already has this kind of warpy underwater quality that music fit on perfectly, and his whole deal was kind of crazy, because once people started finding out about his tapes and he was making them out of his house, people just started showing up at his house to buy them, to the point where there'd be lines down the street and police were coming by thinking he was a drug dealer. So he had to put a sign, people can only come from 7 to 9 every night to buy tapes from me. But he was able to start a whole store based on the money he made on selling those tapes. Pretty amazing.
That's pretty amazing,
and hip hop in general, just the way that tapes circulated in that scene. And that's something I kind of knew about before too, but I didn't really realize all the weird details of, so DJs would play parties and come up with new break beats. Someone would make a cassette of it, pass it around. That DJ would go to a party the next night and hear the break that he'd come up with being used by another DJ because he'd heard it on the tape in between. And then the DJs themselves started selling the tapes themselves, and Grandmaster Flash made a living off of just selling tapes, and not just from parties. He would make them in his house, and somebody, usually a drug dealer, would pay him a lot of money to make just a personal tape for him. And I found a couple of his tapes that people somehow saved, uploaded to YouTube, where he's saying in between the songs, this is for a specific person, and if anybody who's not him is listening to this, I'm going to find you, or whatever, you shouldn't be hearing this tape. Which is kind of crazy, just not only the fact that it's sort of interesting that he made personal tapes, but the idea that you could make sound and reasonably expect only one person to hear it.
Right.
Like right now, anybody who records any music, everyone's going to hear it eventually.
Yeah, and even with that idea with the tapes, you know, like in those scenes, like, oh, this one tape comes out, and then all of a sudden, like, everybody's listening to it. Like, somehow it, like, quickly disseminates out.
Yeah.
And
yeah, much faster than if they had waited for someone official to press copies of a record or get it on the radio or whatever. I mean, there's a story in there about how when Rapper's Delight, which was the first kind of mainstream rap song, came out, every DJ in the world had heard that style 4 or 5 years ago, at least all the ones in New York, because things were flying so much faster on tape than they were on any kind of official releases.
yeah, that can really foster those localized communities, which I thought, like I said at the beginning, like overall, you know, on the international level, because the tape is cheaper, and in places that might have restrictions on what could be released, or just money-wise, like you talk about it in the your tape hunter chapter of, you know, tapes in the Middle East and Vietnam and Thailand, of all this traditional music that's never really been shared or heard outside of these communities, are able to be preserved and eventually re-released by people who are hunting down these like incredible gems. It's just, I thought it was just beautiful. This little thing has really shaped and preserved and helped grow music scenes and subcultures.
Yeah, I mean, in non-Western cultures, it was actually even more of a freeing thing, because not only did they have the barrier of needing to have enough money or acceptance to be on a label or to go to studio, the government actually was trying to restrict what music got heard. So certain regional styles would be considered not appropriate for the masses or whatever, and so they would say to record labels, you can't put this music out. But people who had dubbing decks and blank tapes did it anyway. And I think it's Egypt. There's a great book about the whole scene in Egypt that just came out last year by Andrew Simon called, I'm forgetting, but if you Google cassettes in Egypt, you'll be able to find it. They actually set up a whole panel, like a ministry of sort of a censorship panel, where they were meant to listen to every tape they could find. They would go out on the streets and buy all the and listen to them and decide whether they should be censored or not. But there were like 8 people on this panel, and there were like 1,000 tapes coming out a week, so they were never able to listen to all of them. They never got any control of the situation, which I think is pretty amazing. I mean, there's whole books have been written about, like, there's an Egypt one, there's a great one by Peter Manuel called Cassette Culture that's about Northern India culture tapes. And so I was a little intimidated first about going into that whole thing from a perspective of a white person in a Western country but both those guys who wrote those 2 books that I really liked lived in the countries in order to be able to write them. I wasn't going to be able to do that for one chapter of a book. So, but I think I came up with an okay solution by presenting it through the lens of people who are going over to these countries and rescuing a lot of these tapes and finding a lot of the music that wouldn't survive otherwise if the tapes went away. And a lot of the, you know, awesome tapes from Africa, Sublime Frequencies, Sahel Sounds. I think they're making pretty good efforts to try to find the artists too and compensate them if they make any money off of these releases. And I mean, like Omar Soleiman would not be known here if Sublime Frequencies hadn't found his tapes. There's a lot of artists like that. Pretty amazing, because it's like, that's where tapes are like a living archive of music. If they go away, these people didn't save any masters or duplicate them on any other formats.
Did you interview a lot of people, and do you have a favorite kind of story from
for that section?
Or just, I guess in general for the book, like.
I mean, there's a lot. I probably did about like 100 or so interviews for the book, and there's a ton of stories that I really like. I mean, I like this guy Jed Bindeman, who he's in the band. I'm not sure if they're still together. Eternal Tapestry. He's been in a couple other bands too, and he has this great reissue label with Pete Swanson called Freedom to Spend. But he also has this Instagram account called Concentric Circles, where he's trying to find as many tapes from the 80s and 90s, low-run tapes, things that came out maybe even in edition of 1 or whatever. He'll post them there and post some of the music. He's found some crazy rarities. And there's a story he told me for the book where his girlfriend went to a Goodwill, and there was this Goodwill, and I think they're in Portland, has this process where there's a bin, the stuff that hasn't sold for a while, they dump it in the bin, and every Sunday you can go in and pick through the bin, and if it doesn't go away, they throw it away. She found a tape in there that looked kind of interesting, just handwriting on it. You know, it's 10 cents or whatever. Takes it home. They both listen to it. They really like it. There's like kind of a name on it. They couldn't quite figure out who it was, but he worked, tracked down the woman who made it. She was living in England, a teacher in England. She had never released anything, but she had recorded music on tapes before with her friends, and she was pretty sure that was the only copy in existence. So it was like 5 minutes away from being completely gone. He's since put it out on LP. Her name's Carola Bear. It's really good. It's great music, and it's also just sort of amazing that it was so close to being completely vanished. And as for all she knew, it was no one was ever going to hear it.
Almost did. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, twist of fate.
Yeah. And then there's also the relatively famous story, but I just sort of replicated from news sources of this woman who's an artist who kind of focuses on decaying objects and things, and found a mixtape that washed up on a beach in Spain, I think, and enough of the audio was recoverable that she could figure out some of the songs, and it was part of a installation she did with the tape and some of the music. And another woman who I think was British goes to this and says, that playlist sounds super familiar. She, when she made mixtapes, had the foresight to make CDRs of every mixtape she ever made. Went back and found the CDR, and it was her mixtape that had washed up on the beach.
Whoa.
Yeah. Oh, pretty cool story.
Yeah, that's great.
We do some Q&A.
Q&A.
Yeah.
I'll just talk.
You just talk.
Okay.
You want to come up? Game show?
In your research, did you discover like a race to be the format, like a VHS Betamax thing? Like, why were 8 tracks allowed to flourish for so long if cassettes were coexisting? You know what I mean? Or did 8 tracks, were they there, but just before tape cassettes? And that's why that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there was kind of everybody was sort of racing to come up with a format that would be the most profitable for sure. So, and there was kind of a little bit of competition between 8 tracks and cassettes, but 8 tracks sort of initially were about being in cars and planes for some reason. Part of the development was from a guy who owned a fleet of planes and wanted to be able to put 8 tracks. Not sure how that works. I don't know if the pilots are supposed to listen to them or they actually put them over the loudspeakers or whatever. But I think that 8 tracks ultimately just got kind of swamped by the so much more ease of use and convenience of cassettes. And I don't know that I guess there were portable 8-track players, but those didn't really seem to catch on. And I mean, I had an 8-track player in our house, and it was incredible. Did you ever?
Yeah, we had them in our car, in the car.
Yeah.
Yeah, in our house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That weird thing where there were 4 programs, the album was split into 4.
Yeah.
And so if you were listening to the second song in the first set and clicked over, you were hearing the second song in the second set of 4, I think. It was this really counterintuitive way to listen to music.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of why it happened. And also, I don't know that there were ever that much recordability with 8 tracks.
Yeah.
I don't think. And that's what a lot of people latched on the recordability right away with cassettes. So I don't know that there was ever sort of a cutthroat thing where like Philips tried to put the 8-track out of business per se. I mean, ironically, Philips invented the CD too. So they were happy to squash their own.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy who invented the cassettes had something to do with inventing CDs. And one weird thing that I had no idea about, which I think is true, I found it in a couple sources, is the reason it's called compact disc is they thought compact cassette sounded cool and people would associate. That's the only reason they put compact on it. It has nothing to do with the technology per se, because there's nothing really, I mean, it's small, I guess, compared to a record, but it was only because compact cassette, although by that point, people weren't calling it compact cassette, but I guess they thought it sounded cool still. Anyone else?
Kind of a writing process question. How does the final book different from the original vision you had for the book when you first started?
It came out I mean, I'm really good at it. It's not a ton. I mean, it's decently different in terms of I just kept learning more and more things. Even after I had come up with a draft that I thought was working, I just kept finding more and more stuff. It's such a big subject and it's such a popular subject that things kept popping up. I was at the section I have on genres that have kind of been created by tapes. I think I was close to turning in my draft, and I was at this random party for a friend of my kids' friends' parents or something. I don't even know that, and I just happened to half mention. He goes, "Oh, you've got house music in there, right?" I'm like, "No," and he told me this whole story about how the DJs in Chicago, when house music came up, were DJing with cassettes, and I had enough time, luckily, to research that and insert it in there. That's a little different kind of than what you're asking about. Though structure-wise, it was mostly, I traded some of the chapters around a little bit, but I didn't really, the structure luckily was able to stay the same pretty much through the whole thing. Does that kind of,
yeah.
that's it, yeah.
Mark, as long as we're talking process questions,
Sure.
how long did it take from conception to having the final draft, edited draft sent to the printer? Because you had to research, you had to interview a lot of people.
Yeah, I did do a lot of interviews. I mean, I started in fall of 2018, and then I had to take, like everybody, a break during the pandemic. So probably about a year and a half in there where I wasn't doing anything on it. And then I guess it's been a year since I turned in the first draft, and then we edited it all. About a year or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe 3 to 4 years, something like that. Weirdly, the interviews didn't seem like they took that long. I guess they probably did. Luckily, the auto transcription stuff is a lot better now, because if I had to transcribe all of them, I probably would have added like a year to the process. So that's about how long.
Yeah, I was curious if you, in your research, if you found any fascinating stories from sort of the music industries, what I'm calling the music industries, kind of pushback, especially in the 80s, against like taping, killing music, to use their phrase.
Yeah.
Because that's really fascinating to me, just kind of culturally, and trying to sort of turn off, or trying to stop something that's like unstoppable.
Right, totally. Yeah, well, the first chapter kind of introduces that whole subject. And if people don't know what Nathan's talking about, so when tapes first came out, the industry was really scared that everybody was going to tape each other's records and not buy records as much, and that they were going to lose a lot of money. So all the industries, as they're usually so smart to do, is they start shaming their customers to try to get them to stop doing this. And so the British phonographic industry had the most famous kind of campaign was called "Home Taping is Killing Music, and It's Illegal." And this is my friend Mark Lohr has an old Kiss album that this is printed on the inside label. I mean, look, isn't that cool? I mean, wouldn't you want to take music?
I'm thinking specifically of like a t-shirt. There's some photo of Huey Lewis wearing a t-shirt
Yeah.
with that logo on it.
Yeah.
It just makes you want to do it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I guess it wasn't so hip to be square. I mean, sorry. It was right there. Yeah, I mean, one thing I found that I hadn't heard about before is that KTEL had some stores, I think, where they sold their comps, and also just the staff. And the head of the KTEL company was so on board with what the industry was doing that he had made their employees wear those shirts. And some of them had to put this bumper stickers on their car that said it, which seems like a little bit egregious beyond what you're supposed to do with an employee. I mean, their car wasn't part of the job. But I mean, pretty much the great thing about it was everything they did made it cooler to do what they didn't want you to do. I mean, you know, the famous things are kind of like the Dead Kennedys put a tape out, the one side was blank, and they said home taping is killing music and you can help by putting music on the other side. And it just made it seem so cool to, even more so, I think, than, I mean, they reacted the same way to like Napster. They took we're going to go find you in your house downloading stuff and we're going to sue you. And they somehow this is always their genius idea, is to make people feel bad about it, which just doesn't work. But I think even more so with tapes, tapes already seemed kind of like a personal, kind of private thing you were doing, a kind of clandestine thing. So for the industry to come and say, we don't want you to do that because we're losing money. I mean, who would not be motivated to keep doing it when you hear something like that?
I guess, like, you said how you grew up in the 80s, and like, did you have like, I guess, did you go down to the store and like buy cassettes like all the time, and that was your primary way of listening things? And do you remember like a time when you kind of maybe like switched to CDs? I can at least think of like when I was like kind of deciding about buying something on cassette or CD, maybe when I was like in like middle school in like early 90s or whatever, and thinking like, it came into my mind that like, oh, like the tapes like break. Although I don't really like feel like ones that I bought commercially did, but like it was like something in my like purchasing like choice. I was like, if this is something I like really want, then maybe I should buy it on CD, because I felt like as a kid, like, you know, this is gonna last longer. Although, like you mentioned, they scratch and stuff, but
Right.
just like, yeah, when you kind of, I don't know, make this like transition, and now obviously people buy like cassettes even over like records, and it's just like interesting how it kind of goes back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely gone on eBay much in the past few years and bought things that I had when I was younger that I don't know what happened to them.
Yeah.
Either I got rid of them or sold them
Yeah.
or whatever. It's kind of, on to his question, it's kind of ironic that they didn't want people to tape, yet they were happy to sell you a tape that you could tape over easily. And the fact that, you know, everybody was saying these are high quality enough, but we're still happy to sell you pre-recorded albums on there.
Yeah, right.
But I did buy, I bought a lot of tapes. But, you know, making mixtapes and playing them on my car was the big part. But I liked buying pre-recorded tapes too. They were often cheaper or around the same price as the vinyl.
Yeah.
And some of them really took advantage of, the one I keep thinking of when people ask me this is the Cure singles collection that had all the album on one side and then tons of extra stuff on the other side, which I don't think any format, even when it came out on CD, I don't think it had that much.
Yeah.
And I wore that one. I've gone through like 3 or 4 copies of that
Right.
tape. So yeah, I mean, tapes had that film, and in high school, that was the only way I could listen to them outside my house too. So I bought a lot that way too.
Yeah.
But I did transition to CDs somewhat too. I tried to avoid buying things I already had, but I did that some too.
Yeah.
I mean, I like CDs. I'm not some kind of like a one format champion at all. I just think the cool thing about tapes is they have something that none of the other formats do. They have some qualities that none of the other formats ever had. I think every format has some unique aspects to it, except streaming.
I can remember like the kid on the bus having like the Ice-T like Body Count album with like Cop Killer like on like a dub cassette,
Yeah.
and he would like then like dub it for people, and it was like, oh, this was so, you know, forbidden.
Yeah, totally. There's a new 33 1/3 book on the Body Count album.
Sure.
It's really good.
All right.
I'd totally forgotten how crazy that whole situation was. How the police were coming after Ice-T. It's sort of insane to think of. Anyway, side note.
You mentioned a couple of the sort of reissue, international reissue labels like Awesome Tasty. Do you know? I mean, I just find that part fascinating because those are the ones I'm familiar with, the ones you already mentioned. But are there more that you'd like to know about, or should I just read the book?
No, I mean, I pretty much mostly the people I talk to and cover are Sublime Frequencies, Awesome Tapes, and Sahel Sounds. There are other people doing. I mean, there's Analog Africa, although they're mostly doing vinyl. I mean, I guess all those other labels are doing vinyl now too. So Analog Africa rescues a decent amount of those too. I think Soul Jazz has done a little bit of it too. But yeah, those are awesome. And one of the funny things Brian from Awesome Tapes told me that sometimes when he tracks, he's gone to some great lengths to track down some of these people to figure out who they, because sometimes they recorded under pseudonyms in order not to be found out that their music was getting around. And he's talked to a few people when he tracks them down. They're like, I never put any music out on tape, which means somebody put his music out on tape, but not officially. And that's how he rescued it. But still, it's the only version of that music that ever got recorded.
Mark, are there particular bands that you would have felt were more apt for tapes, or particular performances even?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think especially anybody who recorded straight to cassette, I think it makes more sense to listen to that on cassette. It just, even though that's probably going to kind of, the dubbing doubles up some of the anomalies and stuff, I still think that's sort of the more appropriate way. Yeah. And the sort of obvious people like Sebadoh and Daniel Johnston, and they definitely want to listen to those on cassette because they made them with cassettes. They liked the fact that it was going to get sort of distorted and warped and things like that. I mean, I have some Daniel Johnston tapes that got transferred to vinyl, and I like having them, but it's a little weird to listen to that kind of stuff on record. So I do think there are certain things, certain artists that were really good about. I mean, I don't think it's hard to control how weird tapes sound. So it's not like people became artists with tapes in the sense that they could tell how warped it was going to be or whatever. They just they made music that fit well with the anomalies of how it would come out on the tape.
Well, things like The Shit Hits the Fans, where the band was proud of how awful it sounded.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of an official bootleg in a way, like the Velvet Underground Max's tape, where you hear Jim Carroll talking in between it. You know, that makes much more sense to listen to on tape, I think, too, although the expanded CD is pretty awesome for that, too. Did how much of a collector was your dad with the Dead tapes? Was he really, did he have a lot and really fastidious with them? Or?
I don't think he was, I remember, he was just, kind of one rack. I don't think he went crazy on it, but
Yeah, he does.
Did he go and tape shows himself?
I don't think he did.
Uh-huh.
No, but I know he had friends who did. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's now I talk about in the book this kind of nutty guy, Mark Rodriguez, who's an artist who goes and tries to collect as many dead tapes as he can find, and he's turned it into an artwork that he displays these dead tapes like in museums, just as a big rack of tapes. And he sold a set, and so he dubbed them all first, and then gave it to this art collector. So, which is really probably not anything anybody anticipated happening with dead tapes.
I don't think so.
Rosalie, were the set lists similar on the different cassettes that he had?
Oh man, I should ask my dad if he still has this.
If he does, he should sell them.
Yeah.
Listen to this extended jam on St. Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, he has that kind of brain. He could recall that. But at the time, I was kind of born and raised on the Dead, but I can appreciate them, but I had a long period of like, I don't.
Right.
Sure.
Or like, anything your parents are kind of super interested in. It's like, I don't care.
I mean, it's a pretty, not having been a Dead fan and having been a little scarred by the people who were Dead fans in my college who I don't know, they were just annoying people, but I do really appreciate, but I do really appreciate the community of tapers. I mean, I think most of them were really genuine fans. Yeah. Most of them were very insistent that no one should be making money off these tapes, which I think is pretty cool. Yeah. They lifelong friendships formed around these trading communities, which are really cool. And I appreciate anybody who gets that deep into anything, even if it's not necessarily something I personally like. And I also think it's funny, just like any community, they had their weird, there's not, some of them, once the Dead said, you can't tape here, we're going to make a section. Some of them were like, only the sellouts go to the taper set. I'm still going to go to the other parts of the room, which could have made a difference in how it sounded too. I mean, but anyway, I think it's a pretty cool scene. It's just got so many different fascinating things about it.
And even now, I've had tapers come to my shows, and they're not coming out on cassette, but I really like it. People are there, and usually they'll say, is it cool if I tape it? I like the spirit of it, because they're just capturing this one thing that only the people in the room are able to hear, even if you're playing familiar songs. Everything, or a band that don't play things exactly the same every time. Mm-hmm. It's kind of those people who really want to make a record, capture this moment, because they're so interested in music and they're so passionate about it, and whatever this exchange in the room. I think it's a really awesome thing.
Yeah, it's cool to have fans that care enough to want to take the shows.
Exactly.
Sure. I mean, Lee Ronaldo talks in this about how he was a Dead tape collector and a Dylan tape collector, and then we first saw tapes of Sonic Youth floating around. It's like, we made it. Yeah. People are taping our shows. That was like a big sign to him that they were actually getting where they wanted to go.
I recorded that show you did with the David Nance group with Destroyer at Cat's Cradle.
Oh,
so if you want to hear it, I have it on
awesome.
That's cool. Anyone else want to talk about anything else?
Do you still have a portable tape player?
I do, yeah. I actually have one that in the last move I dug out, and it had been buried in the basement in my previous place for 10 years. And not only did it still work, the batteries were still good. Which I just think is proof that tape's got to be better if even the batteries want to stick around for it. But yeah, I still have, and also, that's the one weird thing about this whole tape resurgence is it is hard to find new tape decks. They're not really, kind of cheap Walkman-y type of things that are meant to digitize tapes are still being made, and high-end tape decks that are ridiculously expensive are still being made, but just your sort of regular component, double dubbing cassette deck. Although, I have a bunch that I found in Goodwills. They're definitely around there, but they're not being made new anymore, which I think that might change.
Or hard to find people to repair them.
Yeah, that's true.
Anybody got recommendations for the area while we're on that topic?
I think they have them at All Day sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Did you go to All Day? I wonder if you went there earlier today, because they sell a lot of cassettes there.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't.
If you're tomorrow, you should stop by.
Okay, yeah.
Anybody? Your tape machine repair people?
There's always people.
Yeah.
There's a place in Raleigh called Jeff's. I don't know if he handles that sort of thing, but he does TVs and other entertainment devices.
People still get their TVs fixed?
I don't know. You might not.
there was a New York Times article like a few years ago, just thinking about the cassette community. I remember that was like these people moved into a house in Long Island and they discovered all these cassettes that were there that from the previous owner, and it was like this whole, I guess, 70s, 80s, like, you know, dance scene. And it was just really neat that it had been like preserved. And, you know, they definitely digitized it so people could hear it. But that was just that like scene. They always had these parties on the weekend and they would just, you know, record the DJ sets and just like something that like kind of like the, you know, African stuff. Like you wouldn't have heard it otherwise. It just gone.
That's a great story. And I think people don't sort of completely appreciate or understand how much tapes are a living archive of things that are more permanent than what, I mean, any of the things that a lot of people listening to music with now could go away so easily. I mean, if you're familiar at all with Bandcamp, it's in a little bit of trouble right now, and a lot of music is up there. And luckily, a lot of the labels also put out cassettes, so it's not going to totally go away if Bandcamp goes away. And same with any kind of streaming service. And I mean, I think all physical formats are important because of that, but especially cassettes because of taping shows and artists using cassettes to tape. A lot of times, it's the only way the music is surviving. Cool. Oh, well, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And I'll be hanging around some too if anyone wants to talk to
Hey, see you. You too. Come on. Thanks. Hey, man. We made it. Good to see you. Hey, Michael. Hey. All right. Great job on the book. Oh, thanks. Yeah. I got in a little bit late. Yeah, driving from the borough.
I actually from across town took me 40 minutes to get here.
Yeah.
Just trying to push your campus.
Yeah.
I got here around 4 and walked the river trail, whatever it's called.
Yeah. That's cool.
When I first got my dog, I said, I haven't been there a while. I'm going to do it tomorrow.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
That's so funny.
Did you get your book signed already?
I did.
I haven't.
I mean, there's all kinds of levels. I'm trying to think, what's the next show?
Mary Lattimore.
She's the harpist?
Yeah. Coming up soon at Motor Coast. I don't remember exactly when, but